The wind was sharp that morning, carrying a chill that didn't belong in late spring. Ethan Cole stood at the edge of his field, hands deep in his pockets, staring at rows of dry, cracked soil that should have been thick with green shoots by now. The sky above was a dull gray, the kind that promised rain but rarely kept its word. He had learned not to believe in promises, not from the sky, not from the bank, not even from himself anymore. The old tractor sat silent a few yards away, its engine long overdue for repair. He had patched it up more times than he could count, but there were limits to what wire and hope could fix. A part of him wanted to sit inside it just to feel useful, to imagine that something was still moving forward. But there was no fuel, and even if there had been, there wasn't enough money to buy the parts needed to make it run right again. Ethan kicked at a clump of dirt, watching it break apart like everything else he had tried to hold together these past few years. The drought had been bad enough, but the rising prices, the debts piling up, the endless calls from the loan officer, it all pressed down on him like a weight that never lifted. He used to dream of expanding the farm, maybe even passing it down someday. Now he just hoped to make it through another season without losing the land completely. Inside the farmhouse, the sound of clattering dishes broke through the quiet. His sister Clara was fixing breakfast. She had moved back in after her husband passed away 2 years ago. She didn't say it out loud, but Ethan knew she worried about him, about the farm, the long days, the loneliness that had crept into his bones. She helped where she could, selling eggs, baking pies for the farmer's market, but the truth was they were both running out of ways to keep things afloat. When Ethan walked inside, the smell of coffee filled the small kitchen. Clara looked up from the stove, her sleeves rolled to her elbows and her hair tied back in a loose braid. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You were out there early," she said, pouring him a cup. "Couldn't sleep," Ethan replied, sitting down at the table. He wrapped his hands around the warm mug and stared out the window. "Ground's too dry again. I don't think the corn's gonna make it." Clara sighed, setting a plate of toast in front of him. "You've said that every year, and somehow it still grows." "Barely," he said, "and barely don't pay the bills." For a while they ate in silence. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the old screen door. The weather had turned strange lately. Storms coming out of nowhere, then disappearing before they did any good. Nature used to be predictable here. You could look at the clouds and tell what kind of day you'd have. Not anymore. Around noon, Ethan drove into town in his rusty pickup. He had an appointment with the bank, and even though he already knew what they were going to say, he went anyway. The man behind the desk, neat in his suit and tie, smiled politely as he slid another stack of papers across the table. "Mr. Cole, we've given you extensions before," the banker said, "but we can't keep delaying payments. The next installment is due next week." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "If the rain comes, I'll be able to sell enough to cover it. Just need a bit more time." "I understand, but policies are policies," the man replied, his voice soft but firm. "Maybe you should consider selling a portion of your land. It could ease some of the pressure." Ethan looked at him, and for a moment he thought he might laugh. Sell the land? The same land his grandfather had cleared by hand. The same fields his father had taught him to plow when he was 10. Selling it would be like cutting out a piece of himself. "I'll figure something out," Ethan said finally, standing up. "Thanks for your time." The banker nodded, already turning to his computer. Ethan walked out into the afternoon heat, the sun glaring down on the cracked pavement. He sat in his truck for a long minute before starting the engine, staring at the empty main street where only the wind moved. The whole town seemed to be fading little by little, stores closing, young people leaving. It wasn't just his farm that was dying. It was everything. By the time he got home, clouds had started rolling in from the west, dark and heavy. The wind was stronger now, pushing at the barn doors and whipping through the trees. He parked the truck and looked up. Maybe finally the rain was coming, maybe tonight. He checked the animals, closed the shutters, and went back inside just as the first drops began to fall. Clara was setting the table for dinner. "Looks like we're getting a storm," she said. "About time," Ethan murmured, glancing out the window. Lightning flickered across the sky in the distance. The air smelled of dust and wet earth, the kind of smell that always made him feel a little more alive. They ate quickly, the thunder growing louder with each passing minute. When the power flickered, Clara lit a candle and smiled. "Feels like old times, doesn't it?" "Yeah," Ethan said, though he was half listening. His mind was on the fields, on whether the rain would last long enough to matter. After dinner, he stepped out onto the porch, letting the rain soak into his shirt. The wind howled through the trees, bending them until they almost touched the ground. It wasn't a gentle storm. It was angry, wild, tearing through the fields with a force that made him uneasy. Then above the thunder came another sound. A strange mechanical roar, low at first, then louder, closer. Ethan squinted into the storm, trying to see through the sheets of rain. The noise grew until it was right overhead, followed by a blinding flash of light and an explosion that shook the ground. For a moment, everything went silent except for the rain. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. Somewhere out in the field, something had crashed. He grabbed his flashlight from the porch and ran, the mud clinging to his boots as he crossed the yard. The air was thick with smoke and the faint smell of fuel. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief light he saw it, a small plane half buried in the far end of his field. The wings were bent, one side broken clean off. Sparks hissed from the wreckage. "Dear God," he whispered, sprinting forward. As he got closer, he saw movement inside. A figure, someone struggling to get free. The door was jammed, so he threw his shoulder against it until it gave way. Inside was a woman, her face pale, a cut above her eyebrow bleeding down the side of her cheek. She was trying to undo her harness, but her hands were trembling too much. "Don't move," Ethan said firmly. "You're hurt." She looked at him through dazed eyes. I need to get out," she said, her voice shaking. "It might—" Before she could finish, a small burst of flame flared near the engine. Ethan didn't think twice. He unbuckled her seatbelt, lifted her out of the cockpit, and carried her away from the wreck. They were about 50 feet away when the flames spread, lighting up the field in orange light. Rain poured down harder, hissing as it hit the fire. He set her down under a nearby tree, checking her pulse. "You breathing okay?" She nodded weakly, wincing as she tried to sit up. "My leg. I think it's twisted." "Don't move," he said again. "I'll get help." He pulled out his phone, but there was no signal. The storm had knocked it out. He looked toward the farmhouse, its lights barely visible through the rain. He'd have to carry her back himself. "You're going to be all right," he said, lifting her gently. She was lighter than he expected, but he could feel the tension in her muscles, the fear. They made it back to the porch after what felt like forever. Clara rushed to the door, her eyes wide when she saw them. "Ethan, what happened?" "Plane went down in the field," he said, breathing hard. "She's hurt. Call the doctor." Clara ran for the phone while Ethan laid the woman on the couch. Her clothes were soaked and she was shivering. He grabbed a blanket, wrapping it around her. Her eyes were half closed, her breathing shallow. "Stay with me," he said quietly. "What's your name?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Amelia." "All right, Amelia. You're safe now. Just hold on." The power went out completely a few minutes later. The only light came from the candles Clara had lit. The storm raged outside, wind howling against the walls, but inside, the world felt still. Ethan sat beside the couch, watching the rise and fall of Amelia's chest. He couldn't help but wonder who she was, where she came from, and what she was doing flying over farmland in the middle of a storm. When the doctor finally arrived, an old man from town who still made house calls, he examined Amelia quickly. "Nothing broken," he said. "A few bruises, mild concussion. She's lucky to be alive. Can she stay here tonight?" Clara asked. "She shouldn't be moved until morning," the doctor said. "Let her rest. I'll check on her again tomorrow." After he left, Clara went to make tea, leaving Ethan alone in the living room. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Amelia stirred, her eyes opening just a little. "Where am I?" she murmured. "You're at my farm," Ethan said. "You crashed out there in the north field." She blinked, her gaze unfocused. "The plane." "Is it gone?" he said gently. "But you're alive. That's what matters." She nodded faintly and closed her eyes again, drifting back to sleep. Ethan sat there for a long time, listening to the storm ease into a quiet drizzle. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke. He looked at her face, peaceful now, and wondered what kind of person she was. A pilot out here alone in the middle of nowhere. By the time the first light of morning touched the horizon, the storm had passed. The sky was clear again, the kind of soft blue that only came after a night of chaos. Ethan stepped outside, the wet grass cold beneath his boots. The wreckage of the plane still smoked faintly in the distance, twisted metal gleaming in the dawn. He felt a strange mix of exhaustion and disbelief. Just yesterday his biggest worry was the failing crops. Now there was a stranger sleeping on his couch, a plane in his field, and a dozen questions with no answers. Clara joined him on the porch, handing him a cup of coffee. "She's still asleep," she said softly. "Doctor said she'll be fine." Ethan nodded. "Good." They stood in silence for a while, watching the morning light spread across the wet fields. Then Clara said, "Funny, isn't it? Sometimes the sky takes everything from you, and sometimes it drops something right in your lap." Ethan gave a small smile. "Yeah," he said. "I just hope this time it's something good." The morning sun was already high when Ethan walked back into the farmhouse. The air inside was warm and quiet except for the faint crackle of the fire still burning from the night before. The smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen, where Clara was humming softly to herself. On the couch, the woman from the crash was still asleep, her face pale but calm. Ethan stood there for a moment looking at her. Her hair was still damp from the rain, her clothes clean but wrinkled from the night. Clara had bandaged her arm and wrapped her leg where she had twisted it. She looked fragile, but there was something about her, something that didn't quite fit the picture of someone lost in a small-town storm. Clara noticed him watching. "She woke up a little while ago," she said quietly. "Didn't say much, just asked where she was. I told her she's safe. Did she say who she is?" Ethan asked. Clara shook her head. "Just her first name, Amelia." Ethan nodded, taking a sip of coffee. "Doctor said she's lucky. Plane's a total loss, though. I'll have to figure out what to do with the wreck." "She's lucky you found her when you did," Clara said. "If that thing had caught fire any faster—" Ethan didn't answer. He didn't like to think about what could have happened. He still saw flashes of it when he closed his eyes. The flames lighting up the rain, the smell of smoke, the sound of her weak voice asking for help. After breakfast, he went out to check the damage. The field was a mess. Mud, broken stalks, pieces of twisted metal scattered like confetti. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. The plane had cut a wide path through the soil, and fixing that section would take days. He climbed into his old truck and drove out to the wreck. The closer he got, the more he noticed. Bits of wiring, a small black box half buried in mud, a bag torn open with papers inside. He picked one up, brushing off the dirt. It was a flight plan with coordinates scribbled across the top. No company name, no logo. Just A. Grant written in neat handwriting. So, Amelia Grant. He folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. Maybe she was just a private pilot. Maybe she was on her way somewhere and got caught in the storm. Still, something didn't sit right. He had grown up around this land. He knew the usual faces that passed overhead. Small delivery planes, crop dusters, old hobby pilots. But hers had been different. Sleek, quiet, newer than anything he'd seen around here. When he got back to the house, Amelia was sitting up on the couch, holding a cup of tea. Clara sat beside her, chatting softly. Amelia looked up when Ethan walked in. Her eyes were a clear gray, sharp even though she still looked tired. "You're the one who pulled me out," she said. Ethan nodded. "You crashed on my land. Lucky I was outside when it happened." "I remember bits of it," she said slowly. "The storm hit harder than I expected. The engine cut out right before I could make it to open ground." "Field's as open as it gets," Ethan said, a hint of dry humor in his voice. That made her smile faintly. "I suppose I owe you a great deal." Ethan shrugged. "Anyone would have done the same." She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Not everyone runs toward fire in the middle of a lightning storm." Clara broke the silence with a gentle laugh. "My brother's got a bad habit of doing things the hard way," she said. "You'll find that out soon enough." Amelia smiled politely but didn't say more. She sipped her tea and looked around the small living room. The walls were lined with old family photos, black and white faces, dusty frames, a shelf filled with farm trophies from years long gone. "This is a beautiful home," she said softly. "Old, but still standing," Ethan replied, "like the rest of us." Later, after Clara went to town for supplies, Ethan brought a chair near the window and sat across from Amelia. Outside, the rain had stopped and sunlight spilled through the curtains. Birds were already back, pecking at the wet ground. "You from around here?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, I was flying from the city heading north. It was supposed to be a short trip." "Got family up there?" She hesitated. "Not exactly. Work, mostly. What kind of work? For a moment, she looked like she was deciding how much to say. Then she gave a small, cautious smile. Finance. Investment projects. Nothing too exciting. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Flying alone in a private plane sounds a little exciting. I like to keep busy, she said, her tone light but guarded. He didn't press her further. There was something in her voice that told him she wasn't ready to talk. He understood that. Everyone carried their own story, and not all of them were easy to tell. Over the next few days, she began to recover. The doctor came by again, saying she'd be fine within a week. She insisted on helping around the house despite her leg still being sore. Clara tried to keep her resting, but Amelia wasn't the kind to sit still. One afternoon, Ethan found her out on the porch, watching him work in the field. The sun was hot and sweat clung to his neck as he fixed a broken fence post. When he looked up, she was smiling faintly. "You work harder than anyone I've ever seen," she said. "Don't have much choice," he replied, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Things don't fix themselves." She nodded. "I've spent years sitting behind a desk watching numbers move on a screen. It's strange seeing work that leaves dirt on your hands." "Real work," Ethan chuckled. "Real work don't pay much these days." There was quiet between them for a moment. Then she said, "You love this place, don't you?" He looked around at the rolling fields, the barn leaning slightly to one side, the faded red paint on the farmhouse. "Yeah," he said. "My grandfather built most of it himself. My dad taught me everything I know here. I guess I don't know how to be anywhere else." She watched him for a long moment. "Must be hard, trying to hold on to something when the world keeps changing." "It is," he admitted. "But you hold on anyway. Because once it's gone for good." A few nights later, a truck pulled into the driveway. It was the loan officer again. A folder tucked under his arm and that same polite smile that made Ethan's stomach tighten. Clara called for Ethan from the porch and he came wiping his hands on a rag. "Evening, Mr. Cole," the man said. "I just wanted to check in. We haven't received any payments this quarter." "I told you I'm working on it," Ethan said, keeping his voice steady. "I understand," the man said, glancing toward the fields. "But the bank's been patient. We can't delay much longer. You might consider selling part of the property, just enough to clear the loan." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Not happening." Before the man could argue, Amelia appeared at the doorway, leaning slightly on her crutch. "Is there a problem?" she asked. The loan officer blinked, clearly surprised to see her. "No, ma'am. Just business matters. Nothing to concern you." Amelia smiled, polite but firm. "I see." After he left, Ethan sighed and leaned against the porch railing. "Seems like every month it's the same talk," he muttered. "Sell the land, give up the fight." Amelia stood beside him, quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What if you didn't have to sell?" He looked at her, frowning slightly. "What do you mean?" "There are ways to restructure things," she said carefully. "Investments, partnerships. If the farm's got potential, it could draw interest." He gave a short laugh. "You sound like a banker." She smiled faintly. "I told you finance is my work. I've seen good people lose everything just because no one looked at their value beyond numbers." "Well, numbers are all that matter to banks," he said. "And mine don't look good." She studied him, her eyes thoughtful. "Maybe not on paper. But this land, your work, it's worth something. More than you realize." Ethan didn't answer. He didn't want to admit how tired he was, how the constant fight had worn him down. Still, there was something in her voice that made him pause. A calm certainty, like she actually believed what she said. The next morning, she joined him as he checked on the animals. She moved slowly but managed fine. The cows lifted their heads as she passed, curious. She laughed softly, reaching out to touch one of them. "They're beautiful," she said. "Stubborn, mostly," Ethan replied. "But they get by." "I envy that," she said quietly. He looked at her, wondering what she meant, but before he could ask, she changed the subject. "I noticed your irrigation system's outdated," she said. "You could improve yield with a few changes." "You sound like you've done this before," he said. "I read a lot," she replied, smiling. "Numbers tell stories too. You just have to listen." That night after dinner, Clara went to bed early, leaving Ethan and Amelia by the fire. The room was dim except for the orange glow of the flames. For a long while they sat in silence. Then Amelia spoke softly. "I wasn't supposed to be flying that night," she said. "The storm wasn't on the radar when I left. I was heading to a meeting about a project. Something big." Ethan listened, not interrupting. "I've spent years helping people invest in ideas," she continued. But somewhere along the line, I forgot what real things looked like. Farms, families, towns like this, they don't fit into spreadsheets. I think that's why I took the plane myself. I needed to see the world from a different height. Ethan looked into the fire. And instead, you fell right into it. She laughed softly. I suppose so. Maybe that's how it works sometimes, he said. The sky gives you a hard landing to show you what's worth holding on to. She smiled at that, a quiet, genuine smile. Maybe you're right. As the days passed, Amelia grew stronger. She started walking without the crutch, helping Clara with chores, even joining Ethan in the fields. She asked questions about the soil, the crops, the equipment. She took notes in a small leather journal she carried everywhere. Ethan didn't know what she was writing, but he noticed how she watched everything closely. His routine, the way he spoke to the animals, the effort he put into saving every patch of land. There was curiosity in her, but also something deeper, something personal. One evening, when the sun dipped low and painted the fields in gold, she stood beside him, her hair glowing in the light. Do you ever think about leaving? She asked. He shook his head. This is home. I wouldn't know where else to go. And if it all disappeared? He paused, looking out at the horizon. Then I'd start again. Maybe not here, maybe not the same way. But I'd start. That's what you do when the world knocks you down. She nodded slowly, as if that answer meant more to her than he realized. Later that night, long after everyone had gone to bed, she sat by the window with her journal open. The moonlight fell across the page as she wrote, There's something different here, something worth saving. This land, this man. He doesn't see it yet, but this place holds a kind of truth money can't measure. When she closed the book, she looked out toward the dark field where her plane had fallen. The wreckage still sat there, a reminder of how quickly things could change. But for the first time in a long while, she felt grounded. Not lost, not searching. Just here. The morning air was cool and fresh, carrying the smell of damp earth. The storm from a few days ago had left behind clear skies and brighter mornings. The fields shimmered with dew, and the sun climbed slowly over the hills, painting everything gold. Ethan stood by the barn, wiping grease off his hands as he looked across the land that had nearly broken him more times than he could count. Amelia had been staying with them for almost 2 weeks now. Her injuries had healed, and she moved around easily. She wasn't just a guest anymore. She had started helping with chores, feeding the chickens, learning how to handle the tools. Clara had grown fond of her. She said the house felt alive again with another voice in it. Ethan didn't say it out loud, but he felt it too. That morning, Amelia joined him in the barn. She wore one of Clara's old work shirts and a pair of jeans that hung a little loose. She looked different from the woman who had crashed in his field that stormy night. More grounded, more real. You up early again? She said with a small smile. Farm doesn't wait, Ethan replied. Besides, I like the quiet before everything wakes up. Amelia ran her fingers along the edge of a wooden stall. I think I'm starting to understand why people fall in love with this kind of life. It's hard, but it feels honest. Ethan gave her a sideways glance. You don't strike me as someone who's used to hard work. I'm learning, she said, her smile widening. You're a good teacher. He laughed softly. Don't know about that. You nearly let the cows out yesterday. I was trying to help, she protested, laughing too. You said open the gate. I said open the small gate, he corrected, not the one that leads to the road. They both laughed, and for a moment the sound of it filled the barn like music. As the day went on, Ethan noticed Amelia taking notes again in her small journal. She had been doing that a lot, writing things down after watching him work. At first he thought she was just curious, but lately it seemed more deliberate, almost like she was studying something. What are you writing all the time? He asked finally, half teasing, half curious. She looked up, startled. Just thoughts, ideas. About farming? About people, she said softly. And the way they hold on, even when everything tells them to let go. Ethan looked at her, then nodded slowly. That's a lot of what farming is. Holding on. She smiled faintly. Then maybe that's what I'm learning here. Later that afternoon, a pickup truck drove up the dusty road. It was old Mr. Grady, one of the neighboring farmers. He leaned out the window and waved. Ethan, heard you had a bit of excitement out here with that crash. Ethan nodded. Yeah, it was something all right. She's doing better, though. Grady's eyes shifted to Amelia, who stood a few feet away, smiling politely. Well, ain't that something, he said. You sure know how to make the headlines. Ethan chuckled. Let's hope not. Grady stayed for a while talking about weather, feed prices, and the drought. When he finally left, Amelia turned to Ethan. Everyone around here seems to know you. He shrugged. Small towns. Word gets around fast. They respect you, she said. I can tell. Maybe, he said. But respect doesn't pay the bank. Her smile faded a little. She had heard him talk about the loan before, about the debt hanging over the farm. It wasn't just numbers. It was a shadow that followed him everywhere. That night after dinner, she brought it up again. You could get help, she said carefully. Grants, partnerships, maybe even an investor. Ethan gave a tired laugh. Investors don't look twice at people like me. They want big returns, fast profits. This farm doesn't do that. Maybe you just haven't met the right kind, she said quietly. He looked at her then, curious. You sound like you know a few. She hesitated. I do. I've spent years surrounded by them. Ethan leaned back in his chair. So that's your world. The people with money, the big plans. It was, she admitted. But it's not the whole story. Some of them actually care about where their money goes. They want to invest in something real, something that lasts. Yeah? And what would you tell them about this place? Amelia looked around the room, the faded wallpaper, the photographs, the faint creak of the old house. Then she looked at him. I'd tell them there's a man out here who works harder than anyone I've ever met, who still believes in what his hands can build. I'd tell them there's land that deserves a chance to live again. Ethan said nothing for a moment. Her words caught him off guard, simple as they were. He wasn't used to people seeing his work that way. You talk nice, he said finally. But talk doesn't fix tractors, she smiled. Maybe not, but it can open doors. The next few days passed quietly. Amelia spent more time outside, walking through the fields with Ethan, asking about the soil, the crops, the weather patterns. She was fascinated by the details, the way he checked the leaves for pests, the way he tested the moisture by hand, the way he seemed to read the land like a story written in dirt and sunlight. You really love this, don't you? She said one evening, as they watched the sunset. It's all I know, he said. When I was a kid, my father used to wake me up before dawn. Said if you don't learn to love the work, you'll end up hating your life. I didn't understand back then, but now I do. Amelia nodded slowly. My father used to say something similar, but his kind of work was different. He measured success in numbers and deals. He didn't believe in anything he couldn't count. Sounds like a tough man, Ethan said. He was, she replied softly. He taught me everything about business, but nothing about living. There was a quiet pause. The sound of crickets filled the air. She looked at Ethan and smiled gently. Maybe that's what I'm learning now. That night, when Ethan went to check the animals, he found Amelia sitting on the porch steps, staring at the stars. He joined her, sitting down with a sigh. Funny thing, she said. When I was a kid, I used to look at the sky and think flying was the only way to be free. Now I look up and think maybe I was just running away from the ground. Ethan smiled faintly. The ground's where life happens. Yeah, she said. I see that now. The next morning, Ethan was up early as usual, but Amelia wasn't at breakfast. Clara said she had gone for a walk. When she came back, she looked thoughtful, like something had been weighing on her mind. I've been thinking, she said over coffee, about what you said the other night, how investors don't look at small farms. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You still on that? She nodded. What if I told you I know people who might? He laughed softly. You trying to sell me something? No, she said, serious now. I'm trying to help. He frowned. Why? You don't owe me anything. I owe you my life, she said simply. And maybe this, helping you, is how I make that right. Ethan didn't know what to say. He looked at her for a long moment, then stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the morning light was spilling over the fields. The crops were still struggling, the earth still too dry. But the thought of someone actually believing in what he was doing, it stirred something in him he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, maybe. You don't have to fix my problems, he said quietly. I know, she replied, but maybe I can help you fix them yourself. That afternoon, she asked to see his financial papers. At first, he resisted. He didn't like anyone poking around in his numbers, especially not someone who came from a world of wealth and deals. But eventually, he gave in. They sat at the kitchen table, papers spread everywhere. Amelia studied them carefully, her brow furrowed. You're not losing money because of bad work, she said. You're losing it because you're paying for outdated equipment, high-interest loans, and old systems. Tell that to the bank, he muttered. I might, she said with a small smile. He looked up. You serious? Completely, she said. If you let me, I'll put together a plan. Something that could attract investors who care about sustainable agriculture. You'd still own the land, you'd just have help running it more efficiently. Ethan stared at her, unsure what to think. Why would anyone invest in a failing farm? Because it's not failing, she said firmly. It just needs a chance. He shook his head slowly. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, she admitted. But it's possible. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch, staring at the stars again. The idea of someone coming in, changing things, it scared him. The farm was more than just a business. It was his life, his family, his identity. But deep down he knew he couldn't keep going the way things were. He heard footsteps behind him. Amelia stepped outside, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. You're awake, she said softly. Couldn't sleep, he replied. Too much on my mind, she sat beside him. You don't have to decide anything right now. I know, he said. It's just hard to trust. I understand, she said gently. But maybe trust is exactly what saves us. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind in the trees. Then she said, You once told me the ground's where life happens. Maybe that's where second chances grow too. He looked at her then, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he let himself smile. In the days that followed, Amelia began working quietly on something. She made phone calls from town, sent emails from the library, scribbled notes in her journal. Ethan didn't ask questions, he just watched, curious but cautious. One afternoon, she came to him holding a few printed pages. I've drafted something, she said. A proposal. I want you to read it. He took the papers, flipping through them slowly. It wasn't written in the kind of language he was used to, but the message was clear. It was a plan, a way to turn his struggling farm into a sustainable one using newer methods, renewable energy, and community support. You really think someone will go for this? He asked. I do, she said with quiet confidence. But I need your permission to send it. He looked down at the papers again, then back at her. All right, he said finally. Let's see what happens. Amelia smiled, relief washing over her face. You won't regret this, she said. Ethan wasn't so sure. But for the first time in years, he felt something different. A spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, the storm that had brought her here had done more than destroy. Maybe it had opened the door to something new. That night, when the lights were out and the farm was quiet, Amelia sat by her window again, watching the stars. She opened her journal and wrote just one line before closing it. The next week brought a strange mix of calm and anticipation. The days were bright and the air was warm, but something in the house felt different, like the silence before rain. Ethan went about his work as usual, but he couldn't stop wondering what Amelia was up to. She'd been busy with her phone calls, her laptop, and those papers spread out across the kitchen table. Sometimes he caught her talking softly into her phone, using words he didn't fully understand, terms about sustainable funding, pilot projects, and agricultural partnerships. All he knew was that she was serious about it. She worked late into the night, sometimes long after Clara had gone to bed. One morning, Ethan walked into the kitchen to find Amelia standing by the window, holding a letter in her hands. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes were bright. "What's that?" he asked. She turned to him slowly, a smile spreading across her face. "It's a reply. From who?" "From someone who wants to meet you." He frowned. "Meet me?" "Yes," she said, almost laughing from excitement. "I sent the proposal we made to a small investment group I used to work with. They focus on funding rural renewal projects. They want to come and see the farm." Ethan blinked. "You're saying investors want to come here? To this place?" She nodded. "They think your story and your land have potential." He let out a low whistle and rubbed the back of his neck. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," she said softly. He hesitated. "And if it doesn't work out?" "Then at least you tried," she said. "That's more than most people ever do." After a long pause, Ethan nodded. "All right. Tell them they can come." The meeting was set for the following week. Clara was thrilled. She spent days cleaning the house and baking like it was a holiday. "If people with money are coming here," she said, "we're going to make sure they see this place at its best." Ethan, on the other hand, grew more anxious as the day approached. He wasn't used to talking to business people. He could fix tractors, mend fences, and read the sky for rain. But investors? That was another world. The morning of the visit arrived with a golden sunrise. The air smelled of hay and dust. Ethan had been up since dawn, checking the fields and making sure everything looked decent. When the sound of car engines echoed up the dirt road, he felt his stomach tighten. 3 cars pulled in, sleek, shiny, and out of place among the old barns and fields. Amelia stood beside him, calm but alert. "You'll do fine," she whispered. "Just be yourself." "I don't know if that's enough," he murmured back. "It will be," she said with a reassuring smile. The visitors stepped out, 2 men in suits and a woman in a neat blouse and boots that looked brand new. They shook hands, exchanged polite smiles, and began looking around. Amelia did most of the talking at first. She explained the farm's history, its challenges, and its potential for renewal. Ethan listened quietly, adding details about the soil, the crops, the water systems. He spoke plainly, the way he always did, and surprisingly, they listened carefully. After walking the fields for nearly an hour, one of the men turned to Ethan. "You've been running this place by yourself all these years?" "Me and my mother," Ethan said. "My father passed a while back. We've done what we can." The man nodded. "It's not easy keeping a small farm alive these days." "No, it's not," Ethan agreed. "But you don't stop just because it's hard." "The land doesn't stop, so neither do I." Something in his voice must have struck a chord, because the woman smiled and said, "That's the kind of determination that keeps communities alive." Amelia watched silently, a small smile tugging at her lips. She could tell Ethan had won them over, not with fancy words, but with honesty. After the tour, everyone gathered around the old wooden table outside. Lemonade, cookies, and Clara's apple pie were laid out. The group asked more questions about sustainability, production plans, and what he would do if given funding. Ethan answered as best he could, sometimes glancing at Amelia for guidance. She would nod slightly, helping him along without taking over. They made a good team, though neither of them said it aloud. Finally, the woman closed her notebook and said, "We'll need to review this further, but I'll be honest. I'm impressed. There's real heart in this place." When the cars finally drove away, the silence that followed felt heavy with possibility. Clara was the first to speak. "You did it," she said, tears shining in her eyes. Ethan shook his head. "We don't know anything yet." Amelia smiled softly. "But they're interested. That's more than I could have hoped for." He looked at her then, really looked, and said quietly, "You've done more for this farm in 2 weeks than I've managed in 2 years." She smiled back. Maybe we just needed to find each other. That night, the 3 of them sat on the porch, the stars bright above them. The air was still and the world felt bigger somehow. Clara broke the silence first. "You know," she said, "it's been a long time since I've seen you smile like that, Ethan." He chuckled. "Don't get used to it." Amelia laughed softly. "I think he's learning how." For the next few days, life returned to its usual rhythm, but something had shifted. Ethan seemed lighter, more talkative. He even started repairing the old greenhouse, something he'd been putting off for years. Amelia helped wherever she could, planting seedlings, sorting tools, and taking pictures of the farm for her proposal updates. Sometimes she'd catch him watching her from a distance, an unreadable expression in his eyes. One evening, as they were putting away tools, he said quietly, "You never told me why you were flying that night." She paused, wiping her hands on her jeans. "I was supposed to meet someone in another state," she said after a moment. "Someone who was offering me a new position at an investment firm. I thought it was my next big step." "And now?" he asked. She looked at the horizon where the sun was dipping behind the hills. "Now I'm not sure I want that life anymore." Ethan studied her face. "You think you'll stay here?" She smiled faintly. "For a while, maybe. There's something peaceful about this place. It feels right." He nodded slowly but said nothing. The thought of her leaving twisted something inside him he didn't want to name. A few days later, a letter arrived in the mail. Amelia opened it with trembling hands. Ethan watched her face as she read, and when her eyes filled with tears, his heart sank. "What is it?" he asked quietly. She looked up, her voice breaking. "They approved it," he blinked. "Approved what?" "The investment," she said, smiling through tears. "They're going to fund your farm. You'll get the money to fix everything. The irrigation, the machinery, even the greenhouse. It's all happening." Ethan stared at her, speechless. For a long moment he couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. Then he laughed, a deep, unguarded laugh that startled even him. He grabbed her by the shoulders and lifted her off the ground, spinning her once before setting her down. Clara came running when she heard the commotion. "What's going on?" she shouted. Ethan turned to her, grinning wider than he had in years. "We did it, Ma. The farm's getting saved." Clara gasped, covering her mouth as tears filled her eyes. She hugged both of them tightly, unable to stop crying. That night was one of celebration. They cooked a big dinner, shared stories, and laughed until late. For the first time in years, hope filled every corner of that house. As the night grew quiet, Ethan stepped outside. The stars were bright again, and the moon hung low over the fields. He heard footsteps behind him. Amelia couldn't sleep either. She asked softly. "Too much on my mind," he said. "It doesn't feel real yet." "It will," she said. "You earned this." He looked at her for a long time. "No," he said quietly. "We earned this." She smiled, her eyes shining in the moonlight. "I'm glad you think so." For a moment they stood in silence, just listening to the night. Then he said, "When they send the money, they'll expect to meet you again, won't they? You're the one who made this happen." She hesitated. "Maybe, but this was always about you. The farm is yours." He shook his head. "Doesn't mean it would have survived without you." Her expression softened. "Maybe we both needed saving." In the following weeks, the change around the farm was incredible. New equipment arrived, old machinery was repaired, and workers from nearby towns came to help rebuild. The greenhouses were restored, and fresh seedlings filled the fields again. The land, once dry and weary, began to breathe life once more. Ethan couldn't believe how quickly things were turning around. Every morning he walked the fields and felt something deep inside him stirring. A quiet pride. A gratitude he didn't know how to express. Amelia was everywhere, helping with planning, managing schedules, even getting her hands dirty when needed. But Ethan noticed she had started receiving phone calls again, short, serious ones. And sometimes after hanging up, she looked distant, almost sad. One evening he asked, "You've been quiet lately. Everything all right?" She nodded, but her eyes didn't quite match her smile. "Just thinking. About leaving?" he asked. She looked at him, surprised. "You knew?" "I could tell," he said softly. "You've been restless." "I got an offer," she admitted. "A big one. A new position overseas. It's something I used to dream about. And now?" She looked down. "Now I'm not sure it's what I want." He took a deep breath. "You don't owe me or this place anything. If you need to go, you should." "I know," she said, "but that doesn't make it easy." The next morning, she stood by the porch with her suitcase beside her. The car that would take her to the airport was already waiting. Clara hugged her tightly, tears streaming down her face. Ethan stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, trying to stay composed. "I'll be back," Amelia said softly. He nodded, forcing a small smile. "You'd better. There's still work to do." She laughed gently, wiping her eyes. "Take care of the farm." "I will," he said quietly. "Take care of yourself." As the car drove away down the dusty road, Ethan stood there for a long time, watching until it disappeared over the hill. The field stretched out before him, full of promise and life. He felt both proud and hollow at the same time. When Clara came to stand beside him, she slipped her arm through his. "She'll come back," she said softly. He nodded. "Yeah," he whispered. "I hope so." That evening the sun dipped low, casting a golden glow over the fields. Ethan stood alone by the fence, the wind tugging at his shirt. The farm was alive again, vibrant, green, full of movement. And yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was missing. He reached down, picked up a small notebook that had fallen by the porch steps. It was Amelia's. Inside on the last page was a note written in her neat handwriting. "This place taught me what real value looks like. It's not in money or success. It's in the soil, the people, and the quiet strength that refuses to give up. I hope you never stop believing in what you've built. I'll see you again, when the fields are ready to harvest." Ethan closed the book and smiled faintly. The night air was cool and the stars were bright again. Somewhere, far above, he imagined a plane crossing the sky, heading toward a new horizon, but carrying a piece of his world with it. He turned back toward the house, the sound of the wind through the crops whispering like a promise. The farm was alive again, and so was he. The seasons passed quietly after Amelia left. The farm, once on the edge of ruin, was alive again. Rows of green stretched far into the distance, the crops strong and healthy under the sunlight. The sound of tractors replaced silence. Laughter echoed from workers fixing fences, and even the old barn seemed to stand a little taller, as if proud of what it had survived. Ethan worked harder than ever. Each morning before dawn, he walked through the fields with his coffee cup in hand, the cool air brushing against his face. Every furrow, every sprout reminded him of how far they had come. He often thought about Amelia, her voice, her ideas, her way of looking at things. Even in her absence, her presence lingered everywhere. Her notebook sat on his bedside table. He had read that final note more times than he could count. Sometimes, when the nights were long and the house felt too quiet, he would open it again, reading her words like a prayer. Clara noticed the way he'd drift into thought sometimes, but she didn't say much. She knew. Mothers always know. Instead, she'd smile softly and say, "She'll be back when she's meant to." Months passed and the first harvest under the new project began. The investors were pleased. Everything they had hoped for was happening. The farm had turned into an example of sustainable growth. Local papers wrote about it, calling it a miracle turnaround. Ethan didn't like the attention, but he was proud. One crisp autumn morning, as the workers loaded crates of produce onto a truck, a black car pulled up at the edge of the field. Ethan wiped his hands on his shirt and squinted against the sun. A woman stepped out, her hair tied back neatly, her coat fluttering in the wind. He froze for a second, almost afraid to believe it. But when she smiled, that same warm, gentle smile he remembered so clearly, he knew. "Didn't think I'd find you still covered in dirt," she said teasingly, walking toward him. He laughed softly, his chest tightening. "Didn't think you'd come back." "I told you I would," she said. When the fields were ready to harvest, they stood there for a moment just looking at each other. Then, without another word, he pulled her into a hug. She didn't resist. For the first time in a long while, everything felt right again. When they pulled apart, Ethan said quietly, "You look different, happier." "I am," she said. "The job offer overseas didn't feel right. I realized I didn't want to go back to that life. I wanted to do something real, something that meant something." "And that brought you back here?" he asked. She smiled. "Partly, and partly because I missed this place." Clara came out from the porch when she saw them. Her face lit up like the morning sun. "Well, look who's back," she said, rushing over to hug Amelia tightly. "We've been waiting for you." Amelia laughed, her voice warm. "It's good to be home." "Home," Ethan repeated softly, the word lingering in the air. Over the next few days, it was as if Amelia had never left. She slipped back into the rhythm of farm life easily, helping with the harvest, organizing shipments, and spending evenings on the porch with Clara and Ethan. The workers adored her. She had a way of making everyone feel important no matter their job. One afternoon, as they were loading the last of the boxes, Ethan noticed Amelia standing near the barn, staring at the fields. He walked over, wiping sweat from his brow. "Looks good, doesn't it?" he said. She nodded. "Better than I imagined." "You did this." He shook his head. "We did this. You started it." She smiled faintly. "I just helped you see what was already here." He looked out at the horizon. The sky was a soft blue streaked with gold. I didn't think I'd ever see the farm like this again. I almost gave up, Amelia turned to him. But you didn't. That's the difference. He nodded slowly, then said, When you left, I thought maybe that was it. Maybe the storm just brought you here to help me get back on my feet. But the truth is, you changed everything. She looked at him for a moment, her eyes soft. Sometimes life sends people to you at the exact moment you need them. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you get to keep them. He smiled at that, though his heart beat faster. You planning on staying this time? I was hoping you'd want me to, she said quietly. Ethan laughed softly, shaking his head. You already know the answer to that. That night, the three of them sat around the fire pit in the backyard. The stars were bright, and the air was filled with the smell of burning wood. Clara made her famous stew, and they talked for hours. About the future, about dreams, about what came next.